Hey there, folks. Santi from Arizona. Ghostwriters here. You know what Hollywood wants you to believe? That outlaws in the Old West wore all black long dusters and red bandanas tied around their necks, just waiting to rob a bank. Well, I hate to break it to you, but that's about as accurate as a smoothbore musket at 100 yards. The real outlaws? They look like your neighbor, your store clerk, maybe even your preacher. Let's investigate. The Hollywood Outlaw. Pull up any Western movie from the 1950s or 60s and you'll see the same thing. The outlaw wearing dark clothes, a long coat no matter the weather, boots polished to a shine, and probably a hat with more character than the actor wearing it. Heck, even modern Westerns can't help themselves. They want you to know who the bad guy is from 100 yards away. The truth is, if you were an outlaw in the 1860s through the 1890s, the absolute last thing you wanted was to stand out. Think about it logically for a second. You're trying to rob a bank, steal some cattle, or hold up a stage. You planning to announce yourself with your wardrobe? That's like walking into a police station today wearing a shirt that says, "I'm about to commit a crime." Real outlaws understood something Hollywood forgot. The best disguise is no disguise at all. They wore what everyone else wore. They blended into crowds like a drop of water in a river. When witnesses tried to describe them to the law, all they could say was average height, brown hair, wearing work clothes. That's not very exciting for a movie poster, but it kept you from swinging at the end of a rope. I've been doing this reenactment stuff for quite a long time now, and I can tell you that when we portray outlaws at living history events, the folks who do it right are the ones you can't pick out of a crowd. They're not the ones in the fancy getup. They're the guys who look like they just came in from fixing a fence or mucking out a stable. The romanticized image of the outlaw came later, from dime novels, Wild West shows, and, yeah, the movies. Buffalo Bill Cody and his contemporaries in the 1880s and 90s started dressing up the stories, making everything more theatrical. Can't blame them, they were running a business. But it created this mythology that's been hard to shake ever since. Chapter 1. The Blend-In Strategy. Let me paint you a picture of how this actually worked. It's 1876 and you're Jesse James. You've got a price on your head that could buy a small ranch. You planning to waltz into a Missouri town wearing something memorable? Not if you want to see 1877. Jesse and his brother Frank were notorious for blending in. Photographs of Jesse from the era show him in standard civilian clothes. A regular coat, a plain vest, a basic shirt. Nothing fancy, nothing memorable. When they weren't actively committing crimes, they lived as farmers, stable hands, or ranch workers. Their clothing reflected those occupations because that's what everyone around them wore. The James gang understood operational security before it even had a name. When they rode into a town to case a bank, they looked like drovers bringing cattle to market, or ranch hands heading to the saloon after a long day. Dusty, tired, unremarkable. Witnesses couldn't give good descriptions because there was nothing to describe that didn't fit 1,000 other men. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid operated the same way. We've got actual photographs of Butch. The famous Fort Worth Five picture from 1900 shows the Wild Bunch dressed like successful businessmen or prosperous ranchers. Nice suits, bowler hats, watch chains. They could have been bankers themselves, that was the point. When they robbed that bank in Winnemucca, Nevada in 1900, they rode in looking like cowboys because half the town were cowboys. The Dalton gang tried to rob 2 banks at once in Coffeyville, Kansas in 1892. Big mistake on several levels, but their clothing choices were smart. They wore regular range clothes and tried to disguise themselves with fake beards. Didn't work out for them, but the principle was sound. Look like everyone else until the very last second. Here's something most folks don't realize. In the Old West, there wasn't that much variety in men's clothing anyway, especially in rural areas. Most men owned maybe 2 or 3 sets of clothes total, one for work, one for town, maybe one for Sunday services. They were all pretty similar, durable fabrics, simple cuts, practical colors. So when an outlaw dressed normal, he had a huge pool of similarly dressed men to disappear into. Regional patterns mattered too. If you were operating in Texas, you wore what Texans wore, which was different from what you'd wear in Montana. A drover's outfit in South Texas might include Mexican-influenced gear, like a short jacket and lighter fabrics. Up in Montana, you'd see more northern influences, heavier wools, longer coats. Outlaws paid attention to these details because not matching the local style was as good as wearing a sign. Bob Dalton once said in an interview before the Coffeyville disaster that the key to their success was looking like we belonged wherever we went. That meant clothing, mannerisms, even the way they spoke. The clothes were just part of a larger strategy of invisibility. Chapter 2. Work clothes were outlaw. Now let's talk specifics about what outlaws actually wore, and spoiler alert, it was work clothes. The same denim, canvas, and wool that farmers, miners, cowboys, and laborers wore every single day. Denim was king. Levi Strauss started making riveted denim pants for miners in 1873, and within a decade, they were everywhere in the West. Why? Because they were tough, cheap, and practical. Outlaws wore them for the same reasons everyone else did. You try riding a horse for 8 hours in fancy dress pants and see how that works out for you. The typical outlaw outfit would be denim or canvas pants, a simple cotton or wool shirt depending on the season, a vest if they had one, and a coat or jacket when needed. Nothing special, nothing memorable. I've got a pair of reproduction 1880s work pants, and they're just about the most boring things you've ever seen. Brown canvas, simple construction, built to last. Perfect outlaw wear. Shirts were almost always plain. White, gray, or blue if they were cotton. Red or brown plaid if they were wool flannel. No fancy embroidery. No pearl snap buttons like you see in the movies. Those didn't exist yet. Just simple buttons, often made of brass or bone. Many outlaws favored pullover shirts without buttons at all. Faster to put on, nothing to catch on equipment, one less thing to break. Vests were common, but not universal. They were practical. Gave you extra pockets for carrying things, provided an extra layer of warmth without the bulk of a coat. And in a fight, the extra layer of fabric might slow down a bullet or knife. But plenty of outlaws skipped them entirely. More weight, more expense, not always necessary. Coats and jackets varied by region and season. In the Southwest, you might see a short jacket or no jacket at all most of the year. Further north, longer coats were necessary for survival. The famous duster, that long coat that Hollywood loves, was real, but it wasn't outlaw specific. Everybody wore them when riding in dusty conditions or rain. They were called dusters for a reason. Cowboys wore them, lawmen wore them, traveling salesmen wore them. An outlaw in a duster looked like everyone else in a duster. Here's the thing about store-bought versus custom clothing that most people don't realize. In the Old West, most men bought their clothes ready-made from catalogs or the general stores. Custom-tailored clothing was expensive and rare outside of major cities. Outlaws, who were often on the move and couldn't exactly visit a tailor regularly, relied on store-bought gear even more than most folks. The Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck catalogs from the 1880s and 90s show us exactly what was available and what it cost. A decent work shirt might run you 50 cents. Denim pants were about $1. A coat could be anywhere from $2 to $10, depending on quality. An outlaw could outfit himself completely for under $20, and he'd look exactly like every other working man in the territory. Fancy clothes were actually a liability for outlaws. First, they cost more money. Money that could be spent on horses, guns, or supplies. Second, they attracted attention. A man in an expensive suit riding through ranch country raised questions. Third, fancy clothes weren't durable. You couldn't ride hard, sleep rough, or work cattle in a three-piece suit without ruining it fast. The outlaws who did wear nicer clothes, and we'll talk about them later, usually did so when they were living under an assumed identity in town, trying to appear respectable. But when it was time to ride, time to rob, time to disappear into the wilderness, work clothes every single time. Chapter 3. The real outlaw accessories. Let's talk about the gear outlaws actually carried, and how it differed from the Hollywood version. This is where things get interesting from a practical standpoint. Bandanas. Oh boy, the bandana myth. Yes, outlaws sometimes used bandanas or kerchiefs to cover their faces during robberies, but they weren't wearing them tied around their necks all the time like some kind of gang identifier. That's ridiculous. A bandana was a piece of cloth. You used it to wipe sweat, strain water, cover your mouth in dust storms, wrap an injury, or, yes, occasionally hide your face. But it was just a tool, and everybody carried them. When outlaws did use bandanas as masks, they weren't the Hollywood bright red ones. They were whatever color the outlaw happened to have, usually white, gray, or brown, and they often supplemented them with hats pulled low and coat collars pulled high. The goal was coverage, not style. Gun concealment was a real art. John Wesley Hardin, who we mentioned in the gun tricks video, had leather pockets sewn into his vests and coats specifically for hiding pistols. Other outlaws used shoulder holsters under coats, or Mexican loop holsters worn inside their waistbands. The key was having quick access while not advertising that you were armed. Now, plenty of regular folks carried guns openly in the West. It wasn't unusual, but an outlaw might want to conceal his weapons for a couple reasons. First, some towns had laws against carrying firearms within city limits. Second, if you're trying to blend in at a bank before robbing it, having two guns visible on your hips might make people nervous. Third, concealed weapons gave you the element of surprise. Boots were functional, not fancy. Most outlaws wore standard work boots, leather, mid-calf height, practical heels for riding, not the ornate tall boots with fancy stitching you see in movies. Those expensive boots were for wealthy ranchers and Wild West show performers. Real outlaws wore boots that could handle mud, rocks, stirrups, and miles of walking without falling apart. Spurs are interesting. Many outlaws didn't wear them at all because they were noisy and could catch on things. When they did wear spurs, they were simple working spurs, just enough royal to encourage a horse without the jingling, jangling nonsense of parade spurs. I've made the mistake of wearing jingly spurs during a reenactment scenario, and let me tell you, trying to sneak anywhere sounds like a one-man band, not ideal for criminal activity. What outlaws actually carried in their pockets and saddlebags was pretty standard stuff. Tobacco and rolling papers, matches, a knife, maybe a pocket watch if they were prosperous. Ammunition, some food, water, basic repair items for tack and weapons. Nothing exotic, nothing theatrical. The most important accessory an outlaw had was a good horse and quality tack. A fast, reliable horse could mean the difference between escape and capture. Outlaws invested in their horses and their saddles more than in any article of clothing. They needed horses that could run, that could handle rough country, and that wouldn't break down under hard use. The saddle had to be comfortable for long rides and able to carry supplies. Chapter 4. Regional differences matter. One thing Hollywood gets completely wrong is treating the Old West like it was all the same place with the same culture. In reality, clothing varied significantly by region, and outlaws who understood this used it to their advantage. In Texas and the Southwest, you'd see lighter fabrics, Mexican influences, and gear adapted for heat. Cotton shirts instead of wool, lighter weight pants, sometimes shorter jackets or vests instead of long coats. Hats had wider brims for sun protection. An outlaw operating in South Texas in 1880 might wear a cotton shirt, canvas pants, a simple leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat with some Mexican styling. He'd blend right in with the vaqueros and ranch hands. Move up to Montana or the Dakotas, and it's a different world. Heavier wools, longer coats, warmer materials. An outlaw in Montana in winter needed the same buffalo coat or heavy wool overcoat that everyone else needed just to survive. The Curry Gang operated in the Montana-Wyoming area, and photographs show them dressed in typical northern range gear. Heavy coats, wool shirts, practical cold weather clothing. Arizona presented unique challenges. Extreme heat in summer, cold in winter, and dramatic differences between desert lowlands and mountain areas. Outlaws operating around Tombstone or Tucson in the 1880s adapted their clothing to the climate. Light colors to reflect heat, loose fits for air circulation, and multiple layers they could add or remove as temperatures changed. California outlaws, and there were plenty of them in the 1850s through 70s, often dressed more like townspeople than cowboys because California had more established settlements. The notorious outlaw Tiburcio Vasquez, who operated in California in the 1870s, dressed like a prosperous rancher or businessman when he wasn't actively committing crimes. Spanish and Mexican influences were strong in California, so outlaws there might incorporate elements of that style. Cultural influences created even more variety. Areas with strong Mexican populations saw outlaws adopting elements of vaquero dress, not because it was exotic, but because it was normal there. Conchos, bolero-style jackets, different hat styles. These were all standard in the Southwest and made an outlaw fit in better. Native American influences appeared in some regions too, particularly in items like moccasins, buckskin clothing, and certain decorative elements. But this was more common in earlier periods or in areas where Native and Euro-American cultures overlapped significantly. Urban outlaws, yes, they existed, dressed like city folks. Bowler hats, suits, regular shoes instead of boots. Some of the most successful con men and thieves in Western cities looked like bankers and lawyers because that's who they were trying to impersonate. A good suit was their work uniform. The smart outlaw understood that a cowboy outfit in a mining town raised eyebrows, just like a miner's gear looked out of place on a ranch. Matching your clothing to your current location and supposed occupation was basic tradecraft. Chapter 5. The Rare Exceptions. Now, I promised you I'd talk about the exceptions. Those outlaws who did dress notably and why they could get away with it. Because yes, there were some, and their stories are actually pretty interesting from a practical standpoint. Doc Holliday is the classic example. Doc wasn't really an outlaw in the traditional sense, more of a gambler and occasional lawman who operated in the gray areas. But he's worth discussing. Doc dressed well. Suits, vests, nice boots, sometimes a nice hat. We're talking about quality clothing here, the kind that cost real money. Why? Because his cover profession was professional gambler, and gamblers were expected to look prosperous. A shabby gambler was a losing gambler, and nobody wanted to play cards with a losing gambler. Think about it. If you walked into a saloon and saw 2 poker games going, one run by a guy in a worn-out coat and dusty pants, the other by a fellow in a clean suit with a gold watch chain, which table looks more legitimate? Which one makes you think this man knows how to win? Doc could wear nice clothes because his entire persona required them. It was part of his business model. A gambler in rags looked desperate, and desperate men cheat. A gambler in fine clothes looked successful, and successful gamblers attracted players with money. When he needed to blend in or disappear, he probably dressed down. But we have photographs of him in proper gentleman's attire, because that's how he made his living at the tables. The same applied to other professional gamblers who occasionally crossed legal lines. Their fancy duds were their uniform, their advertisement, their proof of success. I should mention that Doc's clothing choices also reflected his background. He was a dentist, a trained professional from a good family. Even when he went west for his health and ended up in the gambling life, he maintained certain standards. Some habits die hard. Billy the Kid is another interesting case, and one that's been mythologized to death. We've got that famous tintype of Billy from around 1880, and he's wearing what looks like a nice vest, a decent shirt, and a respectable hat. Not fancy, not Doc Holliday level, but not rough work clothes either. Why? Probably because he was having his picture taken and dressed up for the occasion, like people did. Getting your photograph taken in the 1880s was a special event. You didn't roll in off the range covered in dust and sit for a tintype. You cleaned up, you put on your best clothes, you tried to look presentable. The rest of the time, probably standard range clothes, nothing special. The myth of Billy the Kid got so embellished that it's hard to know what's real anymore. Every account from the 1880s and 90s tried to one-up the previous one, but the folks who actually knew him, and there are written accounts from people who met him, said he was average-looking, average-dressed, and wouldn't stand out in a crowd. That tintype is the exception, not the rule. It's a snapshot of one moment, dressed up for the camera, not his daily reality. Some outlaws dressed up when they went to town, specifically to appear respectable. The idea was to look like a prosperous cattleman or merchant, someone with a legitimate business in town. A nice suit could open doors and deflect suspicion. Oh, that fellow, he's a cattle buyer from Denver, has an appointment at the bank tomorrow. Meanwhile, he's casing the bank for a robbery. But these were costumes for specific purposes, not daily wear. You can't ride hard and sleep rough in a 3-piece suit without ruining it fast, and outlaws couldn't afford to keep replacing expensive clothes. Belle Starr, the famous female outlaw, supposedly dressed in elaborate riding outfits with feathers and fringe. You see illustrations of her in dime novels wearing outfits that would make a Wild West show performer jealous. Reality check. Most photographs of Belle show her in pretty standard women's clothing for the era. Simple dresses, practical riding outfits, nothing extraordinary. The elaborate outfits came later, after she'd already achieved notoriety and was playing up to her reputation for photographers and journalists. When she was actively involved in criminal activities, horse theft, harboring fugitives, and the like, she probably dressed like any ranch woman of the period: practical, durable, forgettable. Here's the pattern you'll notice. The truth is, outlaws who dressed flamboyantly usually did so after they had already been identified and had prices on their heads. At that point, they were either running their own Wild West shows, living under protection somewhere, or about to be caught. Once your face is on wanted posters across 3 territories, discretion becomes less important than legend building. Some outlaws leaned into their notoriety, started dressing the part people expected. But that's the end of the career, not the beginning. Flashy clothes and long criminal careers didn't mix. The outlaws who lasted, who pulled jobs for years without getting caught, those were the boring dressers, every single time. Chapter 6. After the crime, disguise and escape. One aspect of outlaw clothing that's particularly interesting is how they use quick changes and disguises to escape after crimes. This is where the practical nature of their clothing really mattered, and where you can see the difference between Hollywood nonsense and actual frontier survival skills. The ability to quickly change your appearance was crucial. Some outlaws carried extra clothes in their saddlebags: a different colored shirt, a spare hat, maybe a coat they could reverse to show a different color. Now, I know what you're thinking. Reversible coats sound like something out of a spy movie, but they existed. Simple construction, 2 different colored fabrics sewn together, and you could flip it inside out in about 10 seconds. Rob a bank in a gray coat, ride around a corner out of sight, flip it inside out to brown, swap your black hat for a lighter one you had rolled up in your saddlebag, and suddenly you're a different person. Not completely different. You're still the same height and build, but different enough that a witness description doesn't match anymore. Here's the thing about witness descriptions in the Old West. They were notoriously unreliable. People under stress don't observe details well. A bank teller who just had a gun pointed at his face might remember "tall man in a dark coat" or "3 men, one with a beard." That's not much to go on, but if the description was specific, "man in a gray coat with a black hat," and you could change those 2 details, you just eliminated yourself from the suspect pool. False identities required appropriate clothing, and this is where outlaws had to be smart. If you were going to claim to be a cattle buyer, you needed to dress like a cattle buyer. Decent clothes, not too fancy, boots that showed some wear, maybe a ledger book in your saddlebag for show. If your false papers said you were a freight wagon driver, you better look the part. Rougher clothes, work gloves tucked in your belt, dust on your boots. Outlaws who successfully evaded capture for years usually had multiple sets of clothing for different identities stashed in various locations. A set of respectable town clothes at one hideout, work clothes at another, maybe even a miner's outfit if they were operating near mining country. I've heard stories, can't verify them all, but they make sense, of outlaws who would stash clothing at specific locations along their escape routes. Water a stolen herd near a certain creek. There's a hollowed-out tree with a change of clothes. Rob a stage on a particular road. Friendly ranch 3 miles off with spare gear waiting. This required planning, but the smart outlaws were planners. The value of plain clothes became most apparent during manhunts. Posies were looking for men matching specific descriptions from witnesses. If that description was wearing blue denim pants, brown shirt, black hat, well, that described about 70% of men in the territory. The outlaw who could blend into a town or ranch and work alongside regular folks without anyone looking twice had a huge advantage. I read an account once of a sheriff who rode right past the man he was hunting because the outlaw was dressed as a ranch hand mending a fence. The sheriff was looking for someone fleeing, not someone working. The clothes sold the illusion. Some outlaws went straight, and their clothing helped sell the transformation. They'd settle in a new town under a false name, buy a small ranch or business, dress like every other respectable citizen, and disappear into normal life. The clothes weren't a disguise at that point. They were their new identity. There are documented cases of former outlaws who lived out their lives as shopkeepers, farmers, or ranch owners, and nobody ever knew about their past because they looked and acted like everyone else. Jim Younger, one of the younger brothers who rode with Jesse James, spent years in prison after the Northfield raid. When he got out, he tried to go straight. Photos of him from that period show a respectable-looking man in town clothes. You'd never guess his history. The clothing was as part of his attempt to be someone else. Unfortunately, his past caught up with him anyway, but the principle was sound. Real escape strategies rarely involve outrunning the law on horseback like you see in movies. Those dramatic chase scenes with guns blazing and horses at full gallop. Great cinema, terrible tactics. Horses can't maintain a gallop for long distances, and wearing them out meant you'd be on foot with an angry posse closing in. More often, real escape involved disappearing into a crowd, lying low on a remote ranch where you had friends, or assuming a false identity in another town. Clothing that didn't draw attention made all of this possible. The smartest outlaws understood that their best chance wasn't in being faster or tougher than the law. It was in being invisible. And you can't be invisible if you're dressed like Hollywood's idea of a desperado. The boring truth. So there you have it, folks. The truth about outlaw clothing in the Old West. And it's pretty boring compared to what Hollywood sells us. No black hats marking the villains, no elaborate get-ups announcing criminal intent. Just regular men in regular clothes trying very hard not to be noticed. The most successful outlaws understood that the best costume was no costume at all. They wore what everyone else wore, they looked like everyone else looked, and when the law came asking questions, witnesses couldn't provide details that helped. Average height, brown hair, work clothes, wasn't much to go on. This doesn't make for exciting movies, I'll grant you that. It's hard to tell the good guys from the bad guys when they're all wearing the same denim pants and cotton shirts. But that's exactly why real outlaws dressed the way they did. Because it worked. Next time you watch a Western and see the outlaw in all black with a red bandana and a long coat, just remember, the real outlaw is probably the guy in the background who looks like he just came from fixing a fence. That's the truth of it. Thanks for watching, folks. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go change out of these boring but historically accurate clothes into something more comfortable, which is basically the same thing, but cleaner.